Hello and welcome to Lamestream, a show that guides you through the crisis in media and how it's impacting everything. I'm Osman Faruqi. I'm here with my co-host Scott Mitchell. Scott, we have to start the show with the sad news of the passing of the brilliant actor Sam Neill. How are you feeling about that?
Yeah, so sad. I mean, I think something that is really special about Sam Neill, I don't think it applies to that many actors, is aside from all the incredible, iconic film roles, Jurassic Park, Event Horizon, all the Australian TV miniseries, all of that work, I feel like just everybody knew he was a great guy. Like, his persona publicly became so known, particularly in later years, this incredible friendship, lifelong friendship with Brian Brown and Rachel Ward, his friendships with other actors, the short-lived relationship with journalist Laura Tingle that I think for a while just about every millennial journalist considered that couple like the height of couple goals. But his kind of passion and curiosity and care for others was so evident, I think, and people just knew he was such a legend and really associated with him. So a terrible loss.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think as well as him being in so many iconic performances, he just came across as a really great person. Australian Story on Monday, they replayed the episode on him, and the kind of warmth came through and all the stuff about him, getting into wine growing in New Zealand and his family story. It was all very sweet. I mean, Jurassic Park was the first movie I ever saw in the cinemas. It was terrifying. I was 3 years old. It scared the shit out of me. Don't know why my parents took me there, but sort of gave me my lifelong love of film. I was lucky enough to interview Sam Neill and talk to him about Jurassic Park. And yeah, he was so generous and kind, and everyone I know who's ever spoken to him in a professional capacity said the same thing. So it really does feel like something that hit a lot of people, Scott. And one thing I just wanted to mention, you mentioned so many of his great performances. There's one that I think is like lesser known, but listeners of the show might be really into. It was back in 2004. He directed a film adaptation of a novel called The Brush Off, which is an Australian book that actually is so weird and funny and political. It follows a Labor staffer getting caught up in various corruption and branch stacking scandals in Melbourne, and has to solve murders, and it stars David Wenham. Sam Neill is actually in the first film adaptation, which was directed by his good friend John Clark. He then directs the second one. It's a great couple of films that I couldn't recommend more.
Amazing recommendation. I'm going to fire that up. And I think speaks to the fact that he was the kind of actor we don't see much anymore who was like curious about everything, from politics to winemaking to history to all of those things, like a true kind of curious, engaged artist.
Absolutely. And we should say on the Australian Story, he called himself an old lefty. He had solid politics on social issues and environmental issues, and that kind of era of acting and Hollywood, I feel like, is sadly disappearing. But look, while we're talking about movies, the trailer came out this week for the new film starring your guy, Tom Cruise, Digger. How are the hype levels in this one for you, Scott Mitchell?
They're so huge. I mean, I've always said as soon as Tom's body gave out, the back wouldn't take the stunts from Mission Impossible. He would. I've always said he would return to drama, and he will finally win an Oscar. Look, I'm hoping that it's on his very first outing in this return to drama. That would be incredible. But yeah, very for those who haven't seen the trailer, very Dr. Strangelove vibes, I think. Also influenced by a lot of those kind of Cold War farces by the likes of Billy Wilder and stuff, I think. I think the tension is it going to be as funny as them? That's the trick, because Alejandro Inarritu, the director, and Tom Cruise, not known for their comedy outside of Tropic Thunder for Cruise, but we'll see. We'll see. How are you feeling?
Yeah, I'm excited. I mean, it's fun to see Cruise do something that's not Mission Impossible, and the rest of the cast, Riz Ahmed, Jesse Plemons, looks really great. I'm not a huge fan of Inarritu, but he is very good at directing films that win Academy Awards and win Academy Awards for their leading stars as well. He did that with The Revenant, finally got Leo his Oscar. So it could be, finally, Tom Cruise is Oscar. But I'm excited about this movie. But what is around the corner, Scott, for you and I, that I'm even more excited about is Christopher Nolan's new film, The Odyssey. We've got tickets to see it at IMAX next week in 70mm. Cool fact, Melbourne's IMAX is one of only 30 in the world out of the 2,000 IMAX cinemas in the world that can actually project in 70mm, the way that Christopher Nolan intended. Pretty special stuff. You excited to watch this film with me, Scott?
Yeah, very excited. And also, for anyone listening, know that the only things that seem to get in the way of our working schedule, and we work pretty hard together, Oz, are Socceroos games and newly released Christopher Nolan IMAX movies. Apparently, are the two things that we will interrupt our working day for.
Yeah, this is like sold out at most of the evening sessions. So if you try to get in touch with us on Tuesday afternoon, we may be tied up. There's no reception in IMAX, but we'll do a little bit of a review on it because I think a lot of people are hyped for this film. We'll talk about that next week. All right, coming up on today's episode of Lamestream, what the resumption of the US's war on Iran really means for the region, what happened when the Royal Commission turned its sights on universities and student activists, why the most popular song in Australia right now could end the music industry as we know it, and is One Nation's shine starting to wear off. A lot coming up on today's show, but Scott, let's start with the resumption of war between the US and Iran.
Yeah, Oz, the US and Iran are back to what looks like a real shooting war here. Donald Trump announced the ceasefire was over last week, and since then, over the weekend and early this week, the bombing has gotten far heavier than any of the other kind of breaks in the ceasefire up to this point, and brief returns to hostility. US bombing runs have happened every night this week, sometimes 140 targets bombed in a single night. And Trump, of course, is constantly saying the Iranians are about to make a deal with me, so we don't know where this is going to go, but really, really heavy bombing that looks like the restart of a shooting war.
Yeah, it's very serious, but I just want to say, if you're listening to this and thinking, I can't keep up with what's going on, they're bombing each other, they've stopped bombing each other, Iran blocked the strait, they're tolling the strait, now the US has blocked the strait, now they're tolling the strait. I promise that you're not alone. Like, I personally am finding it pretty difficult. Literally, it's changing hour by hour, day after day. And even when we're trying to think about how to record this, we're like, okay, what could this mean tomorrow? But thankfully, Scott, you are plugged in. You are our guy, tapped into what is going on. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you about exactly what actually is happening there and what it means.
I hope so. I mean, look, we should say we're now 4.5 months into this war, Oz, and it still hasn't achieved really anything for the United States. No one can answer straight questions about what it was supposed to achieve, let alone that it has achieved any of that. I think everyone is trying to figure out, what you said, okay, is this just an interruption? Negotiations are going to come back on. Is the war back on now? How bad could this get? We are going to try and explain why the ceasefire fell apart, how bad a situation we are in now, and where this could be heading. But before we do, Oz, when we were just talking to each other about whether we should cover the war this week, the main thing I kept coming back to is that this return to fighting has just been accompanied by some of the craziest stories of the entire war and of Trump's entire presidency, like accusations of assassination plots against Donald Trump, leaks that the Mossad was grooming Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, of all people, to take over Iran in a coup. Marco Rubio announced yesterday he wants to dismantle the International Criminal Court, the court that's issued warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and other Israeli leaders. Now, in Australia, the media seems very focused on the Strait of Hormuz and oil prices. But for news junkies like us, Oz, who read international media, I feel like there's a lot more interesting and more important unhinged stories flying around about what's going on in the war at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, there was a story a few weeks ago about how the US had basically identified that Israel was spying on them regularly, and that was causing quite high-level tensions between the two countries. But you're right, the main focus in Australia is on oil prices and what could happen if fuel prices go up. What does that mean for interest rates? It's all predictably a bit insular. They are significant and valid concerns, but it is kind of amazing how little of the coverage, even on that, mentions that it's our closest military ally that is the reason that prices are going up in the first place. For example, the ABC story on oil prices surging this week kept using the phrase Middle East tensions. For example,
I did
there's
see
a quote,
this.
The oil price has surged more than 10% following heightened Middle East tensions, and Middle East tensions are at the center of the oil spike. it's a pretty terrible use of passive language. Like, this started because Trump got convinced by Israel to bomb Iran. Like, he could have literally just not done that. This is not about mystical, incomprehensible tensions in that wacky Arabian land in the Middle East and just no one knows what's going on. This is a superpower blowing the shit out of another country. Like, let's just say that when we're reporting on this. But you're totally right. Beyond just oil price goes up, there is so much more going on here that I think is important to understand, even for Australians.
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, let's get into how this got so bad so quickly. The state of play last week was that back in June, the US and Iran had signed a memorandum of understanding, and that was supposed to cover 60 days of ceasefire. No more attacks or threats against Iran from the US and Israel. Billions in Iranian assets unfrozen, and Iran would let ships through the Strait of Hormuz. This 60-day agreement was supposed to set up talks for a final settlement to end the war. But those talks that had been going on had not been going well, Oz. The US wanted the Iranian nuclear program dismantled. The US wanted some say over the Strait of Hormuz, some control, and Trump was still issuing threats on the eve of sit-down talks saying the Iranians wouldn't have a country if they didn't agree, which led the Iranian negotiating team to just walk out on the spot during talks in Switzerland.
Fair enough. Yeah.
The Iranians, on the other hand, wanted an end to the Israeli occupation in Lebanon, the right to sort of still influence things there and retain its relationship with the Hezbollah, and then also either get reparations out of the US, or they wanted to tax ships going through the Strait of Hormuz sort of indefinitely to recoup that reconstruction funding they need. And then, as all of that was going badly, last week, the US and the UAE, it seems, began trying to test Iran's control of the strait. They began telling ships not to use the routes that Iran was approving shipping through, but instead telling ships to turn off their transponders, go dark, and make a run around the Iranians so the Iranians couldn't track them. The Iranians responded by missiling these ships, and the US then responded to that with this declaration, ceasefire's off and a bombing campaign is back. I do think it's significant, though, that the bombing seems to be against bases and oil infrastructure along Iran's coast near the Strait of Hormuz, Oz. You know, if we're thinking about, is this full-on war? You compare that to how this war started. The day it started, 30 bombs dropped on the Ayatollah's compound, his home in Tehran. I think it shows for all of Trump's chest thumping, he doesn't want that smoke again. He wants to keep this, in a way, a localized war that's about the Strait of Hormuz. That is what it's about now for him. That wasn't closed, of course, when he started this whole war. So now it's a war about a strait that is closed because of him. And he, only went into this war because he believed a PowerPoint presentation he got from Benjamin Netanyahu and launched this whole thing. So where do we think this goes? Is there a way out for these sides to climb down? I don't know. What do you think, Oz?
In a rational world, you'd think it'd be relatively easy for the US to just cop the L and move on with things. But it does seem like Trump is pretty desperate here to reassert some sense of US authority in the world when it seems pretty clear that that doesn't exist. Largely thanks to him, right? Thanks to him at the behest of Benjamin Netanyahu trying and failing to take down the Iranian government. They've given up on that, and it made them look pretty weak. So now they're trying to reassert their dominance by focusing on the strait, as you say. It is hard to see someone like Trump walking away and saying, okay, I guess we can't control the strait. Iran can tax shipping, and there's just nothing we can do about that. So I feel like we are going to see this continue, it seems. And it's so like ludicrous that Trump's main defining point, how he positioned himself against other US presidents, was to say, I'm not the guy that's going to get sucked into these forever wars. How many times have we seen this exact same thing happen? Where they say, hey, it'll just be a few weeks. We'll sort it out. Remember when he announced this, he said it would be a few weeks. Then it was going to be 5 weeks. Now it's nearly 5 months. So many times. And the trap here is because you don't want to lose your authority, because you want to look like you still have some control, you keep staying in for longer and longer. We saw it with Vietnam, we saw it with Iraq, we saw it with Afghanistan. Afghanistan, they stayed in for more than a decade, like 15 years, and ended up leaving, and the Taliban just took it over again. And it's just kind of incredible that they think that there is somehow, this time around, things will be different.
Yeah, you're so right about, this war is now going for credibility. Is the US as if they're trying to defend their superpower status, it is all about credibility to show that they can get shipping through the strait, not back down and hand it over to Iran. And just to continue a war, to keep killing people, to maintain credibility is just so disgraceful and disgusting. How many years were the US in Vietnam with countless dead who didn't need to die just to preserve American credibility? The fact that Australia is still along for the ride is disgraceful. And that the best that Penny Wong and Albanese can say is, we call for de-escalation while loaning America our bases, our airfields, our personnel, all of our assets to keep it going. It is a disgrace that Australia is still backing a war and killing that is just about credibility now and ego, not really about anything. One interesting detail that makes me a bit worried, Oz, that this could keep going, is that the US apparently has been using, for the first time, their copies of Iran's Shahed drones, these cheap, slow-moving drones, which the US has reverse-engineered. And I just think it is quite scary if the US is actually able to lower the cost of keeping this war going and use cheaper
That's pretty interesting.
weapons.
I think the Shahed itself was like a reverse engineer of a Sentinel drone that the Iranians sort of kept. It's crazy that this is how modern warfare works now.
Totally. It's so crazy. And it's just, look, it's hard to know what is going to happen. I don't think anyone can say really when things are so unpredictable. But the games being played right now, Oz, through the media, this is what's fascinating to me at the moment. I mean, we mentioned it at the beginning of this chat. First, this assassination plot against Trump, right? This was reported by the Wall Street Journal just as the US had restarted bombing. They said Israel shared intelligence about a new Iranian plot to assassinate Trump, to kill him. The article does say relations had been strained between Israel and the US, with Netanyahu advocating for Trump to get back into the war. So there's kind of like a hint that this intelligence may not be what it
very
seems.
strategically timed. Yeah.
But it was not until the next day that the Wall Street Journal reported that this intelligence was, quote, deemed not to be entirely credible by a US official. So it's bullshit. It's Israeli. It's clearly the Israelis feeding Trump intel that will make him mad and want to go to war with Iran.
Yeah.
That detail, that it was deemed not to be entirely credible, was in an article headlined as if it's an entirely different story. The article is about Qatar gifting Trump a new Air Force One. And it just goes, remember that assassination plot we reported on yesterday? Actually not credible.
That was probably wrong.
Yeah. Very strange that wasn't like in the lead of the first article. Like Israel briefs Trump on not credible assassination.
Plan.
Fake plan.
Totally.
But I do think that just hints, the way that dribbled out, kind of hints at the power struggle going on inside the US administration and the US media over trusting the Israelis, and these different camps developing, I think, as the relationship gets worse. And then, Oz, this Ahmadinejad story. Holy shit. Did you read this thing? This is a wild ride.
This is incredible as an insight into how Israel really operates, and it's fascinating and deeply, deeply concerning.
Yeah, it was reported by the New York Times, and it is over the explosive claim that Israel had long-term efforts to cultivate the former president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, as an asset to install him as Iran's leader during the war. This was apparently such a big operation that in 2024, the then head of the Mossad flew to Hungary to meet with Ahmadinejad in person. And 4 senior Iranian officials told the New York Times that Ahmadinejad is now in house arrest in Tehran.
Yeah, I was going to say, how is he still alive if it's been confirmed that he met with Mossad? So they're keeping an eye on him. They've got him locked down pretty tight.
Fully. I think the interrogation might be rough if this is all true.
Yes.
One First thing I want to say on this is, we were young pups when Ahmadinejad was a big figure in world politics. He's like much more bombastic than any other Iranian leader, said like some really crazy things, had some crazy antics. I just wanted to point out how Netanyahu used that as a propaganda weapon for Israel. So like back in 2009, Ahmadinejad addressed the UN like a lot of world leaders do. And Netanyahu got up later that week and attacked the UN for letting him speak. He said, quote, "A mere 6 decades after the Holocaust, you give legitimacy to a man who denies the murder of 6 million Jews took place and pledges to wipe out the Jewish state," using it to attack the United Nations.
Yeah.
Like, yo, Benjamin, you didn't just want to let him speak. You wanted to install him as like a dictator of a country of 60 million people. How's the legitimacy of that, my man? But I think the serious thing about this, Oz, and the reason I want to mention this story is I just think it illustrates for people how the intelligence agencies in this war are operating and how sometimes what they're up to is stranger than fiction. The idea that we would live long enough to see the Israelis cultivate Ahmadinejad is pretty wild. And this stuff, I think, Oz, really does go on. It happens.
Yeah, it would actually be hilarious if it wasn't so damaging, right, to our social fabric that the Australian media, our politicians, are so keen to present someone like Benjamin Netanyahu as a divine protector of Israelis and of Jewish safety, when this is a government who, yes, they did protect Hamas. They did funnel money to Hamas. Yes, they did nurture Hamas as a way to split Palestinians. That's not crazy conspiracy theories. That is stuff that we know on the record. And yes, now he's involved in a plot to install a guy who he claims wanted to wipe out Israel. That is not a crazy conspiracy. That is being reported by the New York Times. This is how this stuff actually operates, right? And the way that we are being told that this is a guy we've got to listen to, even when he interferes in domestic Australian politics, like, it's all political bullshit from him. He's being accused of corruption. He's slaughtering thousands of people to try to cling onto power and basically just avoid being sent to jail. But you just don't see that laid out clearly in the Australian media, even when stuff like this gets revealed. And on that, after the break, we're going to take a closer look at what's been happening at home as the Royal Commission took aim at universities and student protests. All right, Scott, this week we've been back closely watching the Royal Commission, which has turned its focus to universities and to student protests. I always thought that this block of hearings was probably going to be the point at which we lost our minds. Last week it was Gillian Siegel's completely incoherent attempts to suggest the ABC has some kind of structural bias against Israel. This week, it's the attempt to slander the pro-Palestine student movement as inherently anti-Semitic. Just at the outset, I have to say, the fact that we are talking about student encampments and protests and chants at universities in a royal commission sparked by the Bondi terror attack is honestly a complete fucking joke. Right? There is no evidence either of the Bondi shooters ever set foot on a university campus, right? And look, the one thing I'll say is at least no one is pretending that this block of hearings actually has anything to do with Bondi. It is just an opportunity to relitigate every debate we had in 2024 with student protesters being accused of being driven by anti-Semitism as opposed to well-founded opposition to genocide. But I just can't see how this focus does anything to prevent another Bondi, or honestly, even to prevent anti-Semitism more generally.
Yeah, it's been such a bizarre week of testimony, Oz. Like, most of it has been people who have been on university campuses who say they've experienced anti-Semitism, right? That's the majority of witnesses. Now, some of the things they've recounted are genuinely bad, but I don't know how they rise even the genuinely bad stuff. Some protesters allegedly using like some unkind turns of phrase they probably shouldn't use, but we never hear from them. I don't even know how that raises to the level of Royal Commission. But actually, a lot of it falls into another category that I have no idea like why the Royal Commission would even probe it in the first place? I mean, like
Yeah.
one former student who gave testimony cited this as an experience of anti-Semitism, right? I was like, their university organized a trip to Europe to study the Holocaust, visit the camps. Some of the other students on the trip got drunk the night before these visits, were hungover, and didn't want to go early in the morning and asked to go later in the day. That was testimony of anti-Semitism. Some students who've been flown to Europe get drunk the night before something they're supposed to do. Like, and asked about how the university handled this. This witness goes, oh, well, the two staff on the tour were actually both Jewish, handled it excellently, had a word to them. But I think it should have gone further with like stronger disciplinary action. What? Like, where is the systemic failure here? Like, the people on the tour handled it excellently? What the hell does this speak to? How does it prove anything at all? And look, this is genuinely no shade on this witness, right? They have genuine reasons to feel how they feel. You know, one of their other stories they told, I actually thought was, you know, like I had empathy for. But my question is just this, Oz. What the hell is the council assisting at this Royal Commission doing, putting a story like kids being hungover on a trip to Europe in as evidence at a Royal Commission? Like, the council assisting have pre-interviewed these people. They've vetted
they've read their submissions. They know what they're going to say.
And they've like decided this is the most important testimony. It must be heard. Like at Robodebt Royal Commission or Institutional Sex Abuse Royal Commission, not everyone who made a submission got to speak. There were thousands and thousands of submissions. It was only victim survivors who got to speak where their evidence really proved something about the nature of those systems. Like, those royal commissions didn't go around calling someone who said, like, I thought a priest might be a pedophile. It turned out he wasn't, but I was really distressed. Actually, the other priests handled it really well. Like, that's immaterial. Like, that's just, like, I don't know how this has made it to this level. It just makes no sense for trained lawyers on something so important to think that this is evidence.
Yeah, and it should be said, this is most of the Royal Commission, at least in terms of this block. This is the vast majority of it. And Virginia Bell, the commissioner, has made it clear that the testimony from these kinds of witnesses, so-called lived experience witnesses, isn't subject to cross-examination because it is their, in her words, subjective experience of what happened. And that's a totally defensible position for her to have. But as you raise, it doesn't allow for someone to say, okay, that happened. I'm sorry that you were upset that those students didn't go in the morning. What does that speak to in terms of structural bias at this university? You just don't get that simple question that gets to the bottom of what this is supposed to be looking at. One other bit of testimony was students and academics that were testifying this week, right? There was one Melbourne Uni academic who said that they thought a student protest at their office could have been a terrorist attack, and that in response they hired private investigators because they were concerned that some of the protesters may have links to Hamas, right? That's the evidence given. The fact that this testimony is being heard at a Royal Commission into anti-Semitism, Scott, would make you think that this academic was maybe being targeted by potential Hamas associates because they were Jewish. But then, when you look at the detail of this, the protesters held a non-violent sit-in at this academic's office because they were the lead of a project Melbourne Uni was conducting jointly with an Israeli university, right? And that's an activity that is targeted as part of the academic boycott against Israel. The same kinds of tactic that were used to great success against South African apartheid. 2 students involved in that non-violent sit-in were expelled. 150 university staff signed a letter calling for the right to protest to be protected. Those expulsions were later overturned, but Melbourne Uni has now banned sit-ins and indoor protests, right? So that's the context of that story. And look, people can argue about the tactics of different kinds of protests and whether holding signs in a cordoned off space is more effective than doing an actual sit-in. But if you just take a step back and don't even get involved in that debate for a second, you think about the fact that the Royal Commission, which is costing over $100 million, is spending days hearing this kind of stuff, debates about protest tactics. It's pretty ridiculous to me. And look, for the record, I just want to say that I think the fact that protests like this have been banned is a disgrace. Student protests, including sit-ins that target political actions, like a political decision by university to do a joint project with an Israeli university in the middle of a genocide, a state that is organized in an apartheid and racist manner and is subject to academic boycott calls. I think that's a completely legitimate thing for students to do a nonviolent protest in that way. Student protests have been a huge part of academic, public, and political life for more than a century in this country and across the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this really unfortunate thing where a lot of middle Australia roll their eyes at student protests. There's this very reactionary idea about student protesters, and that is part of how this crackdown on protest has been allowed to happen at universities. But protests on campuses, as you say, have been massively important and influential through the Vietnam War, apartheid in South Africa, the Iraq War. You know, it was national student strikes that led to the Kent State shootings by the National Guard, by the US during Vietnam, changed a lot of minds about the Vietnam War, put a lot of pressure on the administration. It was student protesters in Australia who first started the historic boycott of the South African rugby team, the Springboks, here in Australia, and then that spread to workers and all kinds of people. And look, it's powerful because first, the universities are the way that the intellectual propaganda of these projects is laundered and launched. You look at the neocons and their influence over the Iraq War, all those kind of things. So resisting that, discrediting it, has genuine huge ripple effects. And the universities, as you say, have real research deals, economic influence, the weapons industry. So much of Australia's university system is now tied up in all kinds of ways with the Israeli project. And finally, you look at the great anti-war, anti-imperialist artists, politicians, journalists of like the 20th century. So many of them came up through student protests. Like, it is a great producer of like, people who go far beyond a student protest and a sit-in in a quad. Like, people might start off in politics occupying a faculty office. They end up speaking to a 1 million person march against the Iraq War. That's the story of Tariq Ali. Like, that is how politics is built.
Or you go on to become the Prime Minister of Australia. Remember, Anthony Albanese bragged about his student activist roots. He did a literal sit-in at the University of Sydney to oppose the attempted scrapping of political economy. That's the kind of protest that is now illegal at Melbourne University.
Yeah.
There was, Scott, one academic who provided a bit more balanced evidence this week. Dennis Altman, who is a Jewish academic, he said his concern was not pro-Palestine protesters, which was the big focus of most other witnesses, but actually neo-Nazis. He said that's where his fear was as a Jewish person in Australia. And he said that he was opposed to the way that universities had shut down free speech and the right to protest.
And I didn't say this on Monday's episode, but a great irony of Siegel's insane evidence last week in this Royal Commission is on that same day as we heard that, there was a protest in Melbourne, a far-right neo-Nazi protest, where they chanted, "Jews will not replace us." That happened on the same day Gillian Siegel appeared at the Royal Commission, going on about wanting to control the ABC and SBS. Like, there is a great irony in how this very, very genuine threat against Jewish Australians is getting such little time at this Royal Commission.
100% agree. I think the most compelling evidence this week, Scott, far and away, it was given by a Jewish student, Yasmin Johnson, who spoke on behalf of Students for Palestine. She was involved in setting up the encampments protesting Israel's genocide at Sydney University. And Johnson was basically the voice for student activists throughout this hearing. She gave very strong testimony about why she protested, why opposition to Israel's genocide wasn't anti-Semitic, and why attempts to police and criminalize certain language were actually more about stopping activism against Israel than actually improving safety. Let's listen to a little bit of what she had to say.
What do you say to the suggestion that the pro-Palestinian movement should find different language to convey their point?
I mean, to start with, the idea that a call for freedom is actually a racist call for genocide is a smear on the Palestine movement, which is opposing the systematic denial of rights to Palestinians. I mean, this is a call for freedom from oppression that has been going on for decades. I find it offensive when there is actually a genocide going on and it is being carried out by the Israeli state against Palestinians, something which is regularly forgotten, that our side are the ones calling for a genocide. We are calling for the ability of all peoples to live free from discrimination, regardless of their race or religion, in this land.
Two main thoughts on this testimony, Scott. Firstly, it was extremely clear and sharp and worth watching in full. You can do that on our website. Just an incredible example of how ludicrous the attack on student protesters is. But also, it was pretty surreal, Scott, to watch the cross-examination and the questions put to Johnson by counsel assisting, who is a government-funded lawyer at a government commission, interrogating a student activist about the use of specific language at protests, whether that be language around genocide, whether that be from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. The council assistant even suggesting that they could use certain phrases like free Palestine now, and that would be acceptable language. I mean, this is the kind of McCarthyism that we warned about from this Royal Commission when it was announced.
Yeah, and Johnson made the very good point that if all of those examples were somehow inappropriate, pro-Israel forces would find a way to criminalize the next slogan, you know?
Exactly.
One thing that was so stark to me, Oz, watching this testimony was how she was questioned on her Jewishness several times, like the depth of it, how strongly she identified with her Jewishness and her family talked about it growing up, whether at any time she identified with Israel. Like everyone from the commissioner to the council assisting to the lawyers representing various pro-Israel bodies, they all seemed absolutely brain broken by the idea of a young Jewish woman who doesn't really identify with the project of Israel, and just very revealing of whose story these people have taken at face value, the pro-Israel lobbies side of the story, that Israel is inherent to a Jewish identity. And I'd argue these questions actually themselves incredibly anti-Semitic, to be so incredulous of Jewish people who don't identify with Israel as if they might be lacking their Jewishness in some way. And there's such a long and proud tradition of Jewish people, you know, in politics, across politics, which is not Zionist, which is anti-Zionist or non-Zionist, so many socialist, internationalist Jewish leaders and writers. But yeah, I was just overall quite impressed with her performance, like very rewarding to watch, as you say, this government-funded lawyer looking slightly gobsmacked, confused, and struggling to revise their questions during all of this. But the most egregious thing, just that she is the only witness representing university student protesters after so many stories and allegations have been flung at them, for there just to be this kind of 1 hour of testimony on their side of the scale.
Yeah, your point about how her identity was sort of something that flummoxed people because she wasn't supportive of Israel. When the ABC wrote up a bit of her testimony, they used this phrase, Miss Johnson is Jewish by lineage, but said she had no attachment to Israel. I've never seen that phrase used before in the Australian media, this sort of qualifier. She's Jewish by lineage, which means she's Jewish because that's how Jews identify.
Yeah.
Her lack of attachment to Israel has nothing to do with her Jewishness. It's a political position. And she talked about how her mother went to Israel as a younger person, I think on the kibbutz, you know, it's a socialist kind of a thing, and was appalled by the treatment of Palestinians. And that's why they're not sort of a pro-Israeli family. I just found that sentence to be quite shocking in terms of the caveats applied. In terms of the media coverage of this stuff generally this week, Scott, like with Siegel's testimony, like with the focus on the media, it's all been pretty breathless, non-stop, every witness live blogged, there's stories of being made to feel unsafe by protesters and chants being written up. But when it came to Johnson, I think this is where basically the entire media has been left exposed as to how much of an agenda that they are running here, right? Like her evidence could have been written up as student protester defends activism, or Jewish student explains how family's Holocaust experience turned her into an activist against genocide, or activist explains why opposing Israel isn't anti-Semitic. All things that Johnson spoke to very eloquently, very articulately in the face of some pretty intense cross-examination. But we didn't get any stories headlined or framed that way.
We didn't?
In fact, most of the coverage was framed, believe it or not. Most of the coverage was framed around one comment Johnson made about supporting the right of oppressed people to use violence against their violent oppressor, right? This is the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age's headline. Violence, a legitimate tactic in freedom movements. pro-Palestine student leader tells Royal Commission. The Canberra Times, Jewish student backs violence against colonization. The Herald Sun, murder of Israelis, quote, acts of mass resistance, student activist says. That's how Johnson's testimony was summarized for mass consumption. Most people, Scott, have lives to live. They are not watching every hour of the Royal Commission like us, and that's what they would have taken away, right? But the stupidest thing, I think, about these outlets making that the focus, they're acting like this is some kind of gotcha on the student movement. The right to resist occupation, including through armed struggle, is a right recognized in international law. It's part of the International Bill of Rights adopted by the UN. It is not a radical, lefty, crazy student concept. I can't understand. Do these people not understand that?
Yeah, and they all omitted that she was incredibly critical of Hamas, the council assisting students for Palestine, after these questions came out of questions asked by the pro-Israel groups. And then the council assisting, actually the protesters, Students for Palestine, said, oh, just after that bit they quoted, here's this bit where she was incredibly critical of Hamas. A lot of the media left that out. And I'd just say, you make a very good point that this is an internationally recognized right, but also just every other witness has not had any inconsistency, even if it was an inconsistency, has not had any inconsistency probed or talked about by the media. They're just allowed to make the most outrageous claims, and then later in their testimony where they contradict themselves, the media just omits that. Yes. Whereas this, you don't get any of her story, her feelings. You just get this one attempted gotcha by the pro-Israel lobby. It's egregious.
Totally. And I think it shows how just anything that steps outside the very narrow boundary set by this Royal Commission in its terms of reference is going to be twisted by the media in the most bad faith way. There was so much important and crucial evidence Johnson gave about the movement, about activism, about the need to resist, about why opposing genocide isn't anti-Semitic, and it just didn't get covered very much. And we thought that was pretty frustrating, so we actually interviewed Yasmin Johnson. You can read that on our website, lamestream.com.au right now. We asked her about her decision to testify, what that process was like behind the scenes, the experience of being cross-examined, how her Jewish identity and family background came up, and plenty more. Head to our website, become a subscriber, and that interview and all our stories will be available for you to read. Okay, coming up after the break, why a hit new Australian song has sparked a massive controversy in the music industry. Scott, long-time listeners know that as well as news and current affairs, my other big passion is culture, particularly music, and it's been a big part of my career covering the Australian music industry. It's a topic I want to dive into with you today because there are some seriously fascinating and potentially terrifying things going on right now. And I know that you don't follow the industry quite as closely as I do, but you're a big listener of commercial radio, both because this job demands it and because you genuinely love Flipper and Dingo, whatever their names are.
I do not love whoever Flipper and Dingo are.
Do you have, here's a question for you, right? Do you have any idea what the most played song on Australian radio is right now?
No, because for my sins, when I have to listen to commercial radio, I listen to the podcast. So I just get mainline Fifi, Fev and Nick, no music, and all the music breaks cut out. I don't listen terrestrial.
Well, the best thing about commercial radio, you're missing out. All right, let's have a listen to what has been the most played song on commercial radio for the last couple of weeks. In the midnight hour, I can feel your power just like a prayer. You know I'll take you there. Okay, so that is a song called Like a Prayer by Australian producer and DJ Josh Fawaz. It's a cover of Madonna's 1989 hit song, one of the best songs, one of the best music videos ever. Madonna gets seduced by Black Jesus. Religious groups freaked out and protested. It's great stuff. Just quickly, Madonna, by the way, has a new album out, Confessions 2. Club throwback. It's good stuff. Give it a go. Shout out Madonna. This is not an anti-Madonna take. Don't worry about it. This Josh Fawaz cover of Like a Prayer has gone off. Australians can't get enough of it. It was the most played song on commercial radio, as I said. It hit number 2 on the ARIA charts. It's currently sitting at number 4 behind Tame Impala, G-Flip, and the Kid Leroy's. It's a big, big, big competition. It's had nearly 40 million streams on Spotify, another 15 million on YouTube. something very unusual about this song, Scott. There are only 3 credited performers on the track, the 2 original writers of Like a Prayer and Josh Fawaz. No vocalist is credited, which makes you wonder who is singing, because it's a female voice. It's definitely not Josh Fawaz. So who is it?
Who is it?
It is AI.
Oh my, you're kidding.
No.
What?
No. Yeah, that's an AI generated song, and this appears to be Fawaz's entire shtick. All his most popular songs are covers of big hits like No Scrubs, Sexual Healing, Don't Stop Believing that use AI. Now, AI is becoming a more common part of the music production process. I've spoken to quite a few artists in the past few days who told me about how it's being used to make beats, to help with mixing songs, which is making all the components blend well together, and in some instances generate vocals, though everyone I spoke to said that it's only being used in that way as far as they know, as a kind of placeholder to help producers figure out what kind of sound they need.
Right.
So this appears to be the first example of a massive commercial mainstream hit track that is actually AI generated. And understandably, a lot of people are feeling pretty anxious about what this could mean for the industry. And the first thing that a lot of artists and industry folk are concerned about is the lack of disclosure around how this music is created. There's no label or warning, either on radio or on streaming platforms, that indicate this is an AI-generated track. I've tried to get in touch with Fawaz to ask him about his process and how he made this song, and so far he hasn't responded to my requests for comment. But in an Instagram comment, he did say that he uses AI as a tool. What do you make of that so far?
Yeah, oh my God. I mean, I feel like the disclosure is the big thing. I don't know if there's any argument against disclosing that. I think you should have to. It obviously makes me all uneasy, the idea of AI-generated vocals and what that means for the music industry, both vocalists, but also, music production, engineers, like all of these roles that, would get more work if there was actually a studio recording involved, are sort of cut out of it. And part of me doesn't put that blame necessarily on Fawaz himself, but it just makes me uneasy that the music industry could be heading in that direction. I actually have no idea how exactly you'd try and regulate for that or account for it or try and incentivize people to use real vocal, but it's an incredibly uneasy situation that you think about the amount of talent and knowledge that could be lost from the industry if more and more artists go down that road.
Yeah, I think you're right that this is a conversation that is more interesting when you have it about the industry in totality rather than just focusing on this one particular person. This week, the global recording industry actually agreed on a new labeling system to try to help identify tracks that are AI generated or use AI in the production process. Basically, it's a 2-tier system with one label to identify if AI was used during the process of making a song, but it's primarily still recorded by humans, and another label to identify if the main components of the song, like the vocals, are AI generated. And Fawaz's song would fall into that second category. And this is not just about Fawaz, as I said. This is becoming a big issue in music. In fact, it's fast becoming the biggest issue in music. Apple, Scott, estimates that 30% of all songs now uploaded to its platform are 100% AI generated.
Oh my God.
Right? Spotify is actively pushing AI-generated music on its platform.
Yeah.
It's also recently released a tool that allows users to make AI remixes of popular songs, which I got to say, sorry, Josh Fawaz, but your time in the spotlight might soon be over if everyone can do their AI versions of Like a Prayer. And I think that is the interesting thing here, the motivations of big streaming giants and some major labels to push AI music in front of us, right? In some ways, Josh Fawaz and his stuff is kind of like the canary in the coal mine, or maybe the first major warning sign of where this is all heading and where it could end up. Since the beginning of the music industry, major labels have been trying to get as much out of artists as they can while paying them as little as possible. And it's now pretty clear that they, along with Spotify, have just decided, what if we didn't need to pay artists at all? Like, what if we could just push AI tracks in front of people, collect monthly subscription fees, and laugh all the way to the bank? I do think that is their agenda here. And we're not quite there yet, but we're not far off either. I do think this normalizing of AI music through the remixing of popular tracks is a strategic first step. in these instances, the original artist does still get some payment because they wrote the song, but most of the royalties from the streams go to the person who did the cover, in this instance, the AI cover. It seems pretty clear to me that the next step is just to do away with original compositions entirely and have 100% purely AI-generated music. But of course, and we talked about this on our AI episode, the problem with that is everything AI-generated is actually based on something real humans created in the first place, right? These companies train their models on actual music and actual recordings and actual lyrics, and they then run that through their black box and spit out something they call AI, but it's not magically created. It's real stuff. They just don't have to pay anyone for it anymore.
Yeah, totally. Like every single beat pattern, every intonation in a vocal, every lyric is not some genius of the machine. It's come from something that was originally human that has then trained this model to spit it out. I think the other thing, listening to you talk about this, when you talk about the volume of AI music that is flooding onto platforms, probably remiss of me not to mention this last week when we talked about AI. I actually think the most concerning thing to me about AI in general is just its ability to clog all of the pipes of culture and information that we've come to rely on, like whether it's Spotify or Apple Music or your Instagram feed, your YouTube shorts, your email inbox, your search results. I think we're only just seeing just how much all of that stuff is getting clogged by AI content and the effect that will kind of have on consumption and our ability to find information and culture.
No, I think that's a really good point. And I think partly it's because everyone's just using it a lot now. Partly I think it's because companies are deliberately doing it for these reasons. Because the more we rely on them, the more money they make and the less they have to worry about paying actual human beings to do stuff. In this instance, artists to make music.
And it can just pump out stuff at such a volume and scale as we've never seen before. Like AI can pump out as much content as like the last 30 years of the entire human population. Like it will just flood stuff. It's really worrying.
Totally. It is sophisticated, it's powerful, it is completely transforming cultural production. And I think it's like largely shit as well, right? Including in these instances. So our lives culturally are going to be worse, even though the companies make more money than ever. And again, I love Like a Prayer, but I just can't spend the rest of my life listening to derivative versions of it. That can't be where the future of music goes. And part of the issue is AI is just one part of that. Like even before AI, there was this trend in music towards just relying on covers because it's harder than ever to break through as a new artist with original music. A lot of what gets traction is covers of reworks or remixes of original songs. And one of the most successful Australian artists in recent years is this guy called Lude. He's a producer. His music is not AI generated, to be clear, but the biggest hits are covers of tracks like Down Under by Men at Work, and you want an aria for that. And to me, that just speaks to something that is very broken in music right now. And it's hitting Australia harder than other countries because our market is small, our local audience is small. Streaming means that local musicians are being overwhelmed by stuff that comes from overseas, which now includes AI. And I think it's particularly concerning in terms of the political conversation, which is that instead of discussing how we could be helping local artists, how to protect the industry, which could include things like forcing streaming companies to platform Australian music, making them play a certain percentage of Australian music like we do for local radio, we're in the middle this week of a debate the government is having where they're negotiating with AI companies on potentially weakening copyright laws to allow even more mining of Australian art and music by these companies. It just feels like we're having totally the wrong conversation while this massive wrecking ball is coming for what's left of the Australian music industry.
Totally. And where we land is what was indicated in our show last week, this idea of like that the main government reaction will be like workers should be consulted on that is so inadequate compared to the task you've just laid out and the impact it's having on all of us. Oz, keeping tabs from me this week, I wanted to check in on One Nation polling because it has been a couple of weeks since this dip in One Nation polling first emerged, that they'd gone down by a couple of points from their highs of 30%. And so a couple of weeks in, it does seem like that has happened, which is incredibly welcome news. But I want to read you some recent headlines. Oz, you're our polling expert. I want to throw this at you. Some recent headlines. The varnish has come off. Support slips for Hansen. Has One Nation support hit a ceiling? And my favourite, if Hansen fades, this 4-week stretch will be remembered for the mistakes that brought her down. That really sounds like it's in the rearview mirror, doesn't it? Like you'd think, seeing those headlines, that One Nation has collapsed, Oz. Here's the aggregate number of the opinion polls as it stands today. All of the opinion polls combined. Labor is on a primary vote of 28.1%. One Nation is on a primary vote of 27.9%. 0.2 difference. That is still so terrifying for the country to have a far-right party at that mark. And I think, as we've always said, even if the result of this is a One Nation-led opposition in this country, the consequences of that are so dire, I can't fathom how they're putting this in the rearview mirror already, Oz.
It's kind of astonishing. A couple of thoughts on the polling generally, right? So we try to caution week-to-week movements aren't that helpful, and it's worth looking at the longer trend, and it's worth looking at polling aggregates, because there were a few polls that had One Nation down this week. There are also a couple that had them up, and it's just hard to derive meaning out of that noise. And the thing is, even if One Nation's polling does drop in a particular week, it's hard to link that to one specific thing, because we're polling different people. We can't assume that everyone is locked in a room and reading the same headlines that we are, or journalists are. There's just too many factors here. The other side of it is, if we don't look at just this week's stuff, we look at it from the last few weeks, it does look like it's plateaued a little bit. And I think you could make the case that, okay, if we've got 3 weeks worth of data showing that growth has stopped and perhaps it's pared back a little bit, and that's coincided with a lot more media attention and scrutiny, that could be having an impact. But I caution again, I'm saying could because we just don't know for sure, and it makes sense to wait a little bit longer. And here's the thing, it could go down, it could also go back up. And I think drawing definitive conclusions like some of these journalists are is not that smart. Part of the problem, Scott, is that every news outlet does their own poll and they believe their poll is accurate. So if their poll shows a 3-point dip for One Nation, those journalists have to then come up with an excuse as to why that happened. They can't say, don't worry about this poll, it's just one poll.
Yeah, look, to me, the thing that is fascinating is the media's response to this sort of story and their keenness to call it decline for Hansen, that her bubble has burst. I think a lot of it is quite driven by triumphalism from a lot of the media. And to explain this, there's been some polling, Oz, on One Nation's policies that's come out in the last week or so. Turns out they're incredibly unpopular. So the idea of Australia as a monocultural society, negative 26% approval. The ABC as a subscription service, negative 33%. SBS should be abolished entirely, negative 46%. The best received policy of One Nation had minus 15% approval.
Sure.
This has led a lot of journalists to go, wow, that National Press Club speech was a disaster. People heard her policies. They hate them. This is finally burst the bubble. Therefore, the Federal Press Club did their job. The journalists in that room did their job. This is from Paul Sakal on the weekend about the impact that speech has had. Quote, hardline comments on childcare, abortion and wages are still reverberating online, according to major party hardheads tracking public sentiment. And there have been a lot of similar conversations on podcasts about the influence of that speech. I just think this is so interesting, Oz, because just about the entire political press called that speech a win at the time.
I remember.
Our complaint wasn't just the questions they asked, it's that afterwards they said it was a win for her. Remember these? Charles Croucher, who's Channel 9's chief political correspondent, the day after the speech, quote, by showing up today, Pauline Hanson passed the test. James Massola, Hanson didn't miss a beat in her speech, even when a protest banner was unfurled behind her. The transformation of One Nation into a mainstream political party continues apace. So if that speech really was the beginning of some kind of dent in Hanson's popularity, who knows where it goes, but if that's the truth, then far from vindicating the press, they got it so wrong. They got it incredibly wrong.
Yeah, the number one rule for being a political journalist is just like, oh, never acknowledge you were wrong and just kind of post your way through it. Like,
Yes.
the entire shtick is, I am the smart guy who speaks to all these people and has the truth. So you have to constantly put on that kind of confidence and never take a backwards step. And the thing is, like, it probably is true. I think we've said this before, that the more people think about the specifics of what Hanson's offering,
Yes.
the less appealing she is, because her appeal, and this is our thesis, comes from being the person who wants to blow the system up. Most people don't want to cut public funding to public institutions like ABC and the SBS. They don't want workers to be able to get fired more easily. The bizarre thing about Hanson is, unlike other far-right projects, including Trump, when Trump was running for office the first time around, he was talking about making healthcare cheaper and eradicating student debt and ending wars. It's all a lie, but they pretend to be on the side of people. Hanson just goes out there and says, workers are lazy and they should be fired. And then workers are like, hang on a second. I like that you hate all the people in Canberra because they suck, but I'm a worker. I don't think I'm lazy. And the more she says that, the more I think the shine comes off. But it's got nothing to do with political journalists. And like you say, they were the ones sane-washing her insane speech. Like, they could have written stories being like, well, Hanson basically fucked it because she admitted she hates regular Australians.
Yeah.
They didn't write that, did they?
No. And all the explainers about what a monoculture is and all of this stuff. I mean,
People are like, fuck off. Like,
yeah, and this narrative that the federal press gallery became much more critical of Hanson after that speech and kind of helped turn the tide. Like, I don't really think they did. There's a few exceptions, mostly journalists around the rest of the country, really, not in the federal press gallery, like Sarah Martin at The Guardian. I mean, in Canberra, I would actually say Jackie Maley at the Nine Papers has been pretty strong on this stuff. But I would say, if there has been an exposing of Hanson's policies and how anti-worker they are, how divisive they are, how nonsensical they are, that has actually been led by the new media, the independent media, not the mainstream media. Like, and I don't mean just us. I mean, like, so many outlets, whether that's Punters Politics, Cheek Media, Michael West Media, all of those outlets have done far more to point out the contradictions and bring her policy to the fore in the public conversation than the stalwart political correspondents in this country.
I agree. And Toilet Paper Australia, the social media page on Instagram page, has actually been pumping out like a lot of stuff on how to push back against Hanson, how to talk to people about Hanson, and Cheek has done similar stuff. I do think that a lot of this stuff, these are big accounts, right, that have audiences in the hundreds of thousands, if not in the millions, and that stuff filters through, and I think that is a big part of what we're seeing here.
Yeah.
All right, that is it from us for this Thursday's episode of Lame Stream. If you enjoyed the show, we'd love it if you left us a review or shared it with a friend. Remember, you can head to our website to subscribe and support our work and read all of our articles, including our interview with Yasmin Johnson, who testified at the Royal Commission this week. Scott, I will see you back here next week.
See you next week, Oz.